it had this very special, unique geometry. It also appears to have been carefully located at a very precise and specific place, oriented towards the movement of the heavens. I think what we're seeing here is the outlines of a lost technology.
Was city Atlantis real?
If it was real, I think that there's one area that is the most likely candidate, and that is.
Randall Carlson. Thank you very much for being here. I've been a big fan for a long time.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. I'm now a new fan of yours. I'm going to thank Beckett for introducing us.
I appreciate you saying that. Randall, when, from your perspective, do you believe human civilization has been at its most advanced technological state? Are we at peak technology today, from your perspective?
I think we are at a different technology. We built a civilization on fossil fuels, essentially. And fossil fuels is not the only source of energy upon which we could build a civilization. And you've just asked a very controversial question right out of the gate. My thought is probably a definite possibility. Probably, I can't prove it, but there's so much circumstantial evidence that there have been other orders of civilization that utilize completely different energy regimes. Uh, Primarily based, I would believe, if I had to conjecture, I would believe on plasma, based upon the utilization of plasma, the fourth state of matter. Because I've seen prototypes that are being tested now as we speak that seem to have a lot of parallels with descriptions of some of the ancient civilizations years ago. It's been a while, but I kind of immersed myself in the Vedas, and I do remember reading, the Vimana, the flying machines, the Vajra, the ultimate instrument of cosmic power. I believe behind those stories there is actual technologies that were being employed that have been forgotten. And mainstream archaeology doesn't really go there. But before we started the official podcast, we were talking about some of the stuff that I research and explore. And I said I study catastrophism, what I said, the nonlinear events, the discontinuities within the history of this planet and our civilizations on this planet. And what is not appreciated, for example, by a lot of archaeologists that look at that are trying to recreate the past history of humankind on the earth, is how enormous and severe and extreme some of these events have been. Not only in the history of life, we know that mass extinctions now are a part of the whole process. 40 years ago, 2 generations ago, we didn't really understand that. We saw it as sort of a linear continuum of life on this ascending upward arc, a model of life evolution very much like the models of human civilization evolving. Right, but what we now know is that there are these interruptions, what Stephen Jay Gould called, uh, let's see, what was his term again? Punctuated equilibrium. That there are punctuation marks. Now, he was applying this primarily to the history of life, but I think the model also applies to the history of human civilizations on Earth. And when we understand the extent and the severity of some of these past events and the extent to which this planetary surface has been remodeled, even within the purview of humans on Earth, which depends on whose numbers you use and whose research you use, but it looks like modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, go back conservatively 150,000 years. There are some skeletal remains that look like modern humans that are now dating close to 200,000 years. Well, let's just use that as a framework within which to think. Within that 200,000 years, there have been repeated enormous upheavals. If we go back to what's called the late glacial maximum, which for short we call it the LGM, 15 to 20,000 years ago, sea levels worldwide were 400 feet lower. The reason is because so much glacial ice had amassed on the surface, the continental surface of the planet, that, and of course, the source of the water that froze into that glacial ice was water that had been evaporated out of the oceans. So, at the onset of an ice age, you have this major disruption of the hydrological cycle. Normally, you get water evaporating from the oceans, it precipitates out as rainfall or snowfall. Rainfall, it's going to go into the surface waters, which drain back off into the ocean, or it will go into the subsurface, the subterranean waters, which will eventually, have a much longer cycle, anywhere from thousands up to a couple of 100,000 years, as that water moves uh, through the crust. If it falls as snow, it's going to accumulate for, depends on, I grew up in Minnesota. We had 6-7 months of snow every year. By the end of February and March, sometimes it'd be 6 feet of snow. Okay, spring comes. We were talking about that just over before we got started here, and I would always loved spring because, for one thing, I knew that it was getting close to school being out, and I'd be free again once I was out of school. But we always had fun because when the snow melted, it would create all of these temporary creeks and streams, and we would build dams and try to divert the water and create little mini lakes, and we had so much fun with that. But anyways, my point is that even up all over Canada or northern latitudes, it snows, the snow accumulates, and then in spring it melts away. Well, somewhere in the onset of a glacial age, that normal annual cycle, is just completely disrupted. And it's almost like winter comes on, and then you don't have spring for 10,000 or 15,000 years. And the snow just keeps accumulating and then it compresses into glacial ice. And then eventually you've got, like we had at the late glacial maximum, where over a lot of Canada, you had 1.5 miles of glacial ice, right? So now that water is being evaporated out of the oceans, precipitating out as snowfall. It accumulates, compresses into glacial ice. Spring doesn't come. So that ice doesn't melt and get returned to the ocean. So as the ice increases, sea levels drop. And if we look at the last 2.5 million years, it's almost as if the Earth itself is breathing in a way. So we've had multiple episodes of glacial. We haven't figured out how many yet. Some is that maybe it's 10 or 12 up. Others estimate maybe as many as 40 glacial interglacial cycles. So the ice accumulates, ocean levels drop. What that does then is it causes mass redistribution around the surface of the Earth. It literally changes the shape of the geoid. So now, where the ice was centered in Canada, let's say around the region of Hudson Bay, we can see where the land has started rebounding. Well, it's been rebounding for the last 10 or 12,000 years. With the removal of the ice, the land had been literally depressed by about 1,500 feet. Now the ice is removed, the land rebounds. The weight of that release of the ice, which is now causing a relaxation of the crust below the ice, that ice is melting and going back into the oceans. Most of the ice that melted over North America went back into the North Atlantic Ocean. So now, as the geoid is relaxing under where the ice was and rebounding, you have trillions of tons of weight now being put back into the ocean basins. The oceans are doing this. They're depressing. They're going down. So let's say you've got it looks to me like probably around a 26,000 year cycle we can see in the last 200,000 years. So it's back and forth, glacial, interglacial. We know that there was at least 4 glacial episodes. They learned that way back in the 1950s, 1960s, because when a glacier comes in and you have thousands of feet of ice and it's moving, it's dynamic. It's not just sitting there, it's moving, it's dynamic. As it's moving over the landscape, it's pulverizing the landscape, grinding it up, turning it into a chaotic mass of sand and rocks and boulders and organic material. And it creates a very distinct layer called till. Now, the ice melts, goes away. When it's melting, all that flowing meltwater now engraves a whole nother layer into the landscape. The ice is now gone, the temperature warms, and eventually within about 1,000 years or so, you've got forests growing on top of that glacial till that it's called. 10,000 years goes by, 10,000 years of forest, 15,000 years, and now the glaciers come back. So what you get is this stratigraphy where you can see chaotic glacial till. Then you see the organic material where, you can see the pollen, you can see the leaves, you can see fossilized evidence that there had been life there, right? Then there's another level of layer of glacial till. And then another layer of showing that there were forests, like in Canada, it would be forests. So now you can kind of decipher, and we know what glacial till is because we've seen it being formed by glaciers of the Little Ice Age. So it seems like there's this rhythm that we don't know what's driving it, because is it the sun? I don't know. Is the sun powerful enough? Like at the end of the last ice age, when the climate of the earth warmed up, it did so in an amazingly fast way. I mean, it's like the earth staggered out of the ice age. And you had episodes like, you may have heard the term Younger Dryas.
Yes,
Good.
12,800 years ago or 600
Yeah,
years
right in
ago or
there.
something.
Right there, right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so during the Younger Dryas, you had a couple of episodes where within 3 years, the temperature of the planet changed by 6 to 10 degrees centigrade.
Could
10
you
degrees
out could you
centigrade
could
is,
you could you outline for folks that are not familiar with Younger Dryas what that is? And then also I am curious your perspective on what the world looked like before Younger Dryas compared to
okay,
after,
good
and
question.
what do you believe the potentially most advanced civilizations that existed pre-Younger Dryas were
We'll
like?
come, sure, great. That's a good loop. We can follow that loop. So the Younger Dryas is a period of catastrophic climate change that began, now the dating puts it at between 12,800 and 12,900 years ago.
Mhm.
Uh, the Younger Dryas, it implies that there was an older Dryas, and there was an older Dryas and a Younger Dryas. Now, it gets its name from the Dryas octopetala, which is a cold-loving plant, 8-petaled plant that grows in northern latitudes. It likes the cold, and if it warms up, it disappears. So it was first realized in Europe that there was episodes where the plant was very prolific, which meant that it was very cold, like probably just immediately south of the glaciers over northwestern Europe. Then it disappeared. Well, it disappeared because it got replaced by plants that like the warmth more than the cold. Well, you had the older Dryas, where you could find the remains of the Dryas octopetala, the plant, and then a couple of thousand years went by, and during that between the older Dryas and the Younger Dryas, you have to picture this now. It gets a little complicated, but I'll try to simplify it. The Earth is constantly changing its geometric relation to the sun, right? Sometimes because the Earth's orbit is elliptical, sometimes it's closer to the sun, sometimes it's farther away. Because the Earth's got a tilt of the axis right now, it's about 23.5 degrees, but it wobbles. And there are these three forces that accumulate. Sometimes they cancel each other out. Sometimes they amplify each other. They're called the Milankovitch forces. And it has to do entirely with the relation between the Earth and the sun. Between 15,000 years ago and the beginning of the Younger Dryas, at about 12.8, 12.9, we were in a natural warming period. And earlier I mentioned the late glacial maximum, and I put it at about 15 to 20,000 years. Well, up until the older dryas, you then had about a 3,000 year period between the older and the younger dryas where the climate was gradually warming. While it was warming, the ice mass, the glaciers, were shrinking, and sea levels started rising relatively gently, right? Around 12,860 or 70 years ago, whatever the latest dating is, there was a sudden plunge of global temperature, like up to 10 degrees centigrade, which is up to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And that warming that had been going on for about 3,000 years was completely negated within a couple of years. And the planet appeared to be plunging back into full glacial cold, which had for about 1,300 years. And then at the end of this period, which occurred around 11,600 years ago, there was a sudden spasm of warming. And if we were able to look at some of the ice core records that have now been accumulated and sea bottom core records, we could see this oscillation. And well, here's what we would see. I'll try to do it with my hands. So here's during the late glacial maximum, right? Now here's this gradual warming, and then here's the younger dryas. Whoomp. It plunges. It staggers around, and then it starts up again, and at 11,600, and then it continues on up in a more smooth curve, and by about 9,000 years ago, we're fully out of the ice age.
And
And
the
we're in,
younger dryas is suggested to be a product of a very large impact from an asteroid, kind of like affecting tilt of Earth. Like what's the
well, this
cataclysmic
has been
event
a
that causes that?
controversy for at least 40 years. What caused the younger dryas? And I think that it was the most likely explanation is a multi-impact event.
Hmm.
At, like what could possibly happen if the Earth encountered a cluster of cometary debris from a recent comet breakup in the solar system. I think that the other argument, Robert Schoch argues that it was some kind of a solar storm that affected it.
Hmm.
There's recent evidence to suggest that the stability of the chromosphere and the sun can be dramatically affected by the infall of cometary masses. There's a couple of NASA has captured a couple of very interesting videos showing comets plunging into the sun and instantly followed by gigantic coronal mass ejections.
Hmm.
And I think the theory that is emerging now that to me makes the most sense is that we had what some British astronomers have referred to as a bombardment epoch. And the theory is based on the idea that a really large comet entered the inner solar system about 25,000 to 30,000 years ago and began to undergo a hierarchy of disintegration events.
Hmm.
And for several thousand years, maybe longer, the inner solar system was littered with the disintegrating byproducts of this giant comet nucleus,
Hmm.
which the most likely candidate for the remnant of that is what is now the Taurid meteor stream, which the Earth crosses twice each year, late June, early July, and late October, early November.
And
Anyways, that to me is, I think, is the most likely explanation. But I think it might have been a perfect storm because this infall of material into the sun could actually have caused extreme solar response. So I think we had about a 3,000 year period there where there was a series of catastrophes. And then once you begin to understand the severity of these catastrophes,
they were
it
building
is,
off of each other. They were, or they just happened to be
yes,
coincidence.
no, I think they were building off of each other. I think it was like a coherent response to this phenomena of cometary breakup. And
What would be the initial domino in that? An asteroid impact?
yes, probably so. And now, of course, Not so long ago, you had comets, you had asteroids. They were very distinct and different. Although now there's a whole continuum of hybrids between the two. So whatever struck the Earth, if that's what it was, at the Younger Dryas, uh, its signature is very confusing because it looks like it was an object, a very heterogeneous object, meaning it was made up. It had some attributes of a comet and some attributes of an asteroid.
Hmm.
But the research now is showing that it appears that the proxies, the byproducts of an impact like that, are now being found over half the surface of the Earth. And subsequent research will probably reveal that the proxies are all over the Earth. Now, unless you're familiar with catastrophism and the role that catastrophism has played in the history of this planet, and that catastrophes on an enormous scale have happened since the time we humans have been here.
Hmm.
You don't have the perspective to go say, okay, we can just assume that 150,000 or 200,000 years of human presence on this earth never evolved beyond primitive hunter-gatherer societies, foragers, nomadic tribal societies, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Once you realize that, and it seems like even geologists, I think, have some catching up to do here. Certainly archaeologists do. When they say, where's the potsherds, where's the pottery, where is the debitage that we would expect to find? And we're not finding any evidence of an advanced civilization. That's usually the argument. We don't find the evidence. Well, it depends on how you're looking and what you're looking at. Number one of the things that first intrigued me about this question, I've earned my keep as a builder. I've had a building company, which I'm phasing out now, and I'm retiring from that, but I did it for 40 years. So we had plenty of occasions where we had to move heavy things around, usually steel I-beams. And we knew, okay, once we get over about 1,200 pounds or a ton, we probably want to call in a crane, right? Although we had methods where we could hoist a 1-ton beam up into place. And it's a lot of work and a lot of preparation using mechanical devices. Well, then, you come to realize that ancient peoples all over the world seem to, with impunity, move 10-ton stones, 20-ton, 50-ton stones. We find every continent virtually. Nothing that I know of in Antarctica, but we don't know what's under the ice there. But every continent, there were people, some groups of people that were able to move sometimes even several 100-ton stones. Now, you think a society of hunter-gatherers that's following the seasons, following the game, etc. What would be their motive for quarrying and transporting 40 or 50-ton stones? We build with stones now, but typically the stones we build with are usually within the range of what one strong man can manipulate. We don't build with 10-ton stones. We don't build with 50-ton stones. Why not? Well, because it would be totally uneconomical to do so, right? Well, how is it? You got to say, okay, I can imagine that one eccentric culture in the past, whatever reason, they got obsessed with quarrying 20-ton stones, transporting them dozens of miles, and erecting them into celestial observatories or temples or whatever they did with it. Okay, yeah, there was one of these exceptional groups of weirdos that used all their spare time to do this in between foraging and moving their encampments and all of that. But when you find it repeated over and over and over again around the world, to me, that raises some serious questions. Like, this just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. why would they be doing that in South America? Why would they be doing that in Egypt? Why would they be doing that in Malta? Why would they be doing that in northwestern Europe, in the British Isles, etc.? In North America, what we didn't so much use the big megalithic stones, but we created this monumental architecture. I say we, who are the predecessors of the Europeans, created this monumental architecture out of earth, moving millions of tons of earth. Like if you go to Cahokia along the Mississippi River, go to Emerald Mound in Mississippi, go to Newark up in Ohio. Those are just a few of what were dozens and dozens of these enormous complexes of earth, monumental earthwork architecture that again would have involved moving millions of tons of earth. Why are they doing this? Well, is it possibly because they could? Well, now that raises the question, Aaron. I mean, if they could move large 10-ton up to 50-ton stones, were they doing it just with brute force? Were they doing it with some kind of sophisticated mechanical, pulleys and come-alongs and things like that? Harnessing, oxen or whatever? Or did they possibly have some technological understanding of certain kinds of forces that we have forgotten?
Yeah.
And I lean definitely towards that.
I am looking up as you're talking about examples of this. One is which you already know at least, I'm sure, but Baalbek,
Yeah,
I think is
yeah.
how you pronounce it, in Lebanon. Ancient Phoenician Roman temple site, home to trilithon, 3 limestone blocks, each weighing 800 to 1,000 tons.
I mean, yeah.
So these blocks are quarried and transported over half a mile without cranes or modern machinery. The enigma of that is even the largest modern cranes would struggle to lift them. Purpose and technique of all of this remain debated. That's debated. There's tons of examples of that. Is zero point energy the potential description for that? Is that even the right term for that? Like, is vibration, is acoustics? What is your best guess?
If I was going to, and I'm speculating, and, this is something I'm really learning about within the last few years. My background has been, I'm talking about, movement of water, ice, impacts, all of that kind of stuff. Now I'm kind of segueing over into trying to understand because I've met people that are experimenting with plasma energy and building devices and have seen some of these devices working. Not in the sense of moving heavy weights, but I think the potential is there. Uh, One of the things that I've kind of a useful analogy is that I don't shave much anymore, but I once owned an electric razor, um, but um, if you have any vibrating, imagine, okay, you plug in an electric razor and you put it on a desktop and you turn it on. What does it do? It vibrates and it starts moving around, right? Anybody can do a simple experiment like that. Any vibrating device on a smooth tabletop or desktop, put it on there, turn it on, and it's going to start moving around. Now that's not levitation, but it is moving. Um, so I would think that the most productive line of thought with regards to that would be some type of a vibratory phenomena. Now, how do you do that? Well, that's another question, but it involves frequencies and involves, I think, knowing certain frequencies, and we've inherited a massive knowledge about frequency. If we look, the Bible is full of numbers. The Vedas are full of numbers. The Mayan tradition are full of numbers, and coincidentally, we find a huge overlap in the numbers that are reiteratively occurring over and over again. For example, 108, 216, 432, 864, which like there is an octave, our octave of our modern music goes from 440 cycles per second to 880 cycles per second. So you've got A, the note A at 440, and then the full octave would be vibrating at 864 cycles. Well, 880 cycles. Well, there's a movement now to get back to the ancient method of tuning where it was 432 cycles per second and 864 cycles per second. And if you look that up, if you can read about that, Aaron, look up, 432, just put in cycles per second. You'll probably get up several things at least that are talking about the advantages, the presumed advantages of that particular frequency. Now, we find these numbers embedded over and over again in ancient numerical systems. And my friend Malcolm Bendel has been working on plasma technology for decades, and he's built some devices that only work when these devices have the proportions of the ancient numbers. For example, he's got a device called the thunderstorm generator, which uses plasma vibrating at these high frequencies. And the numbers 432 is the core of the basis of the whole system. So he's got a selection of concentric spheres and cylinders that are interconnected. The lengths of the cylinders are critical. The diameters of the spheres relative to each other. So 4, 3, 2, which that's the fundamental building block number of the whole Vedic system of the yugas. The yugas were the great cosmic cycles, time cycles. You had the Kali Yuga was 432,000 years, at least, and then representatives of that, because the idea was it could also be 432, it could be 43,200, it could be 432,000. If you look at the king lists, the 10 kings that we've gotten from ancient Mesopotamia, actually Samaria, that have come down to us, there were 10 kings that reigned prior to the Great Flood in the Sumerian creation myths. The total number of years that those kings reigned was 432,000 years. And there were a couple of the kings within that reigned. Now, these are mythical, I'm presuming, that they didn't actually reign for 43,200 years. But interestingly, if you take those numbers, you can find them embedded in our day-to-day way of measuring time and space. For example, if we use the mile, and of course people who the skeptics will immediately dismiss it. They'll say, well, if you use meters or kilometers, you're not going to get the same number. You're not going to get that the moon is 2,160 miles, which it virtually is, right? Well, that's double 1,080 and half of 4,320, right? But the point is that you have to measure in miles. Well, miles, where does that come from? Well, it's ultimately derived from human anatomy and the human geometry, the proportions of a human being. A mile is 1,000 paces. Our imperial system that we use in America came from ancient Northern Europe. British Isles is probably where it originated, right? Our mile of 5,280 feet was 1,000 paces, each of 5.28 feet. So if you have a relatively tall man, 6 foot tall, you go out and walk off 100 paces, measure the average length of that pace, it's going to be pretty darn close to 5.28 feet, right? There was a Roman mile, but the Italians were smaller. Their mile was shorter, rather than more than, it was 4,000 and some feet, not 5,280. But the one that we have derived, which is called the imperial system, which is inches, feet, yards, furlongs, miles, etc., we inherited from Northern Europe. We find that the radius of the outer, that measures from the center of Stonehenge Monument to the outer face of the stones, is very close to 52.8 feet, which suggests that they were using, I'll call it, the term is submultiple of the mile, because 52.8 feet times 100 would be 528, times 1,000 would be 5,280 feet. So how interesting that the radius of the Sarsen stone circle at Stonehenge was precisely within a few inches, one one hundredth of a mile. Because I think that they were using the system of measurement that we've inherited 4,000, 5,000 years later. Now, here's the thing. If that particular unit of measurement had unique properties in the terms of its geometry and its ratios, and they're actually, in some of the ancient tuning systems, we find 528 cycles per second. This is the complicate. Aaron, we could sit here and have a conversation for 4 hours about this. I would pull up the graphics. I would show you all of this stuff. But the point I guess I'm trying to make is this. It looks like our units of measurement were had their roots in this system of ancient sacred geometry. And the sacred geometry defined not only the proportions of our world, the proportions of our solar system, the sun and the moon. If you measure in miles, the diameter of the sun is 864,000 miles. Its radius is then 432,000 miles. So there's as many miles in the radius of the sun as there were in the totality of the Sumerian king list, 432,000. Then the Vedic tradition of the grand time cycles starts at 432,000. At the Kali Yuga, the Dwapara is double that, or 864,000. The Treta is triple that, 1,296,000. And the Satya is then 4 times that, or 1,728,000. You take the total of all of that and you get the Maha Yuga, 4,320,000 years. Now, I look at that and I go, we can find those numbers in the Bible. We can find those numbers in Sumeria. I don't know about the Chinese tradition yet, but I would be very surprised if we didn't find them there. But anyways, now that raises questions. Why were they describing, presumably in mythical terms, repetitively these systems of numbers? Now, we take our day as a 24-hour cycle based upon one rotation of the Earth with respect to our meridian, and that lines us up precisely. Imagine the sun with a precise dot in the center. The sun displaces 1/2 of a degree of arc in the sky, right? Imagine a dot right in the center, and you draw a line from our zenith down to the south point, and it passes right through that line. Now we precisely measure a longitude on the surface of the Earth with respect to that line, and we have divided that into 24 subunits we call hours. Well, then you go 60 minutes per hour, 60 seconds per minute, and what do we end up with? 86,400 seconds in a day. Now, at the moment of equinox, and I say moment because we generally think of equinox as being, oh, today, the 22nd of March, is equinox. Well, the equinoxes are only brief, infinitesimal moments of time. As that line, as the Earth as a point, as the zero longitude line on the Earth is passing that local meridian, and we can define that as a second, 100th of a second, a millionth of a second, because it's constantly moving. But if we define a hypothetical point that divides that cycle exactly into two, where day and night are of equal length, you got 43,200 seconds of light, 43,200 seconds of darkness. This could go on and on with these coincidental recursive numbers that are occurring not only in the way we measure time and space, but the way the ancients did, and they encoded these numbers into their myths. Now, from these numbers, which are all derivative of sacred geometry, I get, like, look here up on my shelf up here. Let's see. You can see those figures up there. Those are all the Platonic solids. Well, you build those Platonic solids, and guess what? The numbers that you can that are derivative from the measures of the angles, the internal angles of those Platonic solids. It's the same numbers. So they have a geometric correlation. Now, the work that is being done with the plasma physics seems to show that certain ratios set up frequencies. And that's, like I said, the 4-3-2 of these concentric spheres, right? And when you change those ratios, it seems as if the enhancement, if you want the harmonic overtones, the harmonic amplification ceases, and it amplifies when you have certain ratios, which leads me to think that these numerical systems were part of some kind of a technology that was frequency based. I mean, I kind of broad base this and a lot of gaps and stuff there.
Oh, that's incredible. It also, my one new age contribution to that whole thing is 432 hertz is also suggested to be the frequency that resonates with the heart. It's like heart chakra. So you get like a tuning
Yeah.
fork.
See, we are in tune with this system, this numerical system. Our breathing, our heart rate, all of that. Right, you got it. And probably in there is the core knowledge of, being able to integrate ourselves with the natural cycles and forces to enhance our own well-being. I think there are definitely health and medical applications of this knowledge.
Do you believe that structures such as the Great Pyramids have a level of consciousness or relationship to humanity to this day? Or do you think they're just old, antiquated relics?
No, I don't think they're old, antiquated relics. I guess I'd never thought of them as conscious, but I do think of them as kind of almost instruments or machines. Now,
For what?
here's something that's interesting. Now, in the thunderstorm generator, that now these devices are being built and tested as we speak. You've got a series of concentric spheres, right? 4-3-2. Now you can have two spheres on either end connected by cylinder. Cylinders will have the same ratio. If you cross section and you look at the outer cylinder, it's 4-3-2. Now the dimensions don't matter. What matters is the ratio, 4-3-2. You've got the spheres, you've got the cylinders, you've got two spheres, they're connected by a cylinder. Now, again, this is hard to explain. Maybe some point I can revisit you and we can look at some actual, like, photographs of these machines, uh, and diagrams, and that we can get more into how it appears to be working, because nobody knows for sure how it is working. You've
Yeah.
got a sphere. Now imagine you've got a sphere. If you've got a flat surface and you're going to put a cylinder and interface the cylinder with the flat surface, you simply have to, and you want to conjoin the space, you simply cut a round hole, the diameter of the cylinder.
Hmm.
But if you're interfacing with a sphere, you can't simply cut a round hole and have the two interface, right? Because now if it's a flat plane, the end of the cylinder is just going to be a flat circle, right? But if you're connecting with a sphere, now what happens is the interface of the cylinder has to conform to the sphere. And what that then does is it creates this edge where you transition from the inside of the sphere to the inside of the cylinder. I hope this is making sense.
Hmm.
Now, within this machine, you've got whirling plasma vortices that are moving at a very high rate of speed, right? And what happens is you introduce plasma into this device, and it coheres and self-organizes into plasmoids, which now plasma is the fourth state of matter. And it's what happens when you pump enough energy into a system that the nucleus of the atom and the electron completely disassociate. In solid, liquid, gas, each one you've got greater degrees of freedom, but you've still got a bond between the nucleus and the electron stream, right? The electrons. When you pump enough energy in, they completely disassociate. And then something really kind of weird happens. They become electromagnetic. You can generate power over through these plasmas, but in certain circumstances, these plasmas will self-organize into toruses. And when they do that, one can extract energy. Now, what the thunderstorm generator does is it causes incoherent plasma streams to cohere into plasmoids. It then harvests the energy. But you have to have the first thing that it does is in the spheres, the plasmas are introduced in high pressure, up to hundreds of thousands of RPMs. Then it creates a vortex that moves down the cylinder to the other end. It reverses, comes back again, and again, we could have a much more detailed discussion about this with graphics and diagrams. But the thing is, you have to get this coherent vortex moving through the cylinder. If you transition, what happens is where the cylinder inserts the sphere, that edge introduces turbulence into the system, and you don't get a coherent vortex. So experiments have now used transition collars so that you don't have that edge. What you do is you have this angle between where you interface with the sphere, you have an angle that then interfaces with the cylinder. Through experimentation, it was found that the ideal angle to minimize the amount of turbulence in the transition from a spherical whirl into this vortex was 51.84 degrees. That's the angle of slope to base of Khufu's pyramid, precisely. Now, that to me can't be coincidence. What we extrapolate from that, I don't know for sure, but it does make it look to me like Khufu's pyramid somehow is incorporating this ideal angle for creating coherent plasmoids.
What is your best guess? I mean, this is such like a elementary question, but what is your best guess of the beings or energies or consciousnesses or whatever that constructed some of these archaeological sites, if it is something that it is tied to clearly something more than just a couple ancient people with sticks and stones kind of nudging rocks around?
A bunch of ancient eccentric barbarians. Well, if I want to go and really extrapolate out and extrapolate outrageously, what it looks to me, what it looks to me like there is remnants of an ancient planetary system of utilizing subtle energies of the earth and the sky, and all over the planet we find these incredible constructions. Something that I just recently was researching was, Stonehenge. I mean, everybody knows what Stonehenge is. And once you reconstruct the original plan, it had this very special, unique geometry, right? It also appears to have been carefully located, not just randomly placed, but carefully located on the surface of the earth at a very precise and specific place. It's also then oriented towards the movement of the heavens. Built into Stonehenge are sighting lines for the motions of the moon, the sun through the seasons. It's well known that the summer solstice sunrise uh, forms the alignment of the monument. Okay. Now, recently, it was discovered that there were not just two types of stone being used, there was three. The outer big ones that we kind of picture are called sarsen stone sandstone. They're stones that are high in quartz, feldspar. Quartz uh, a mineral that can actually produce electricity when it's placed under pressure. It has the piezoelectric phenomena. Its inner rings are formed of a rhyolitic bluestone, it's called, which is an igneous rock. So you've got this sandstone kind of base, quartzitic outer rings, and the big horseshoe trilithons. And then you've got this alternate type of stone called bluestone, which is an igneous rock. Well, the the sarsen stones, they came from about 25 miles away and were quarried and transported. The bluestones came from around 120 miles away. They were quarried in Wales. So right there, it seems like, well, the type of stone must have been important. They weren't just randomly setting up stones, right? Well, at the center of the monument, it's probably fallen down now, but there's a stone called the altar stone, and it's on that solstitial alignment. So on the morning of winter solstice, what it appears was going on was the sun is rising um, in the east, in the northeast. A ray of light is shining over the heel stone, which is outside the monument proper, passing through an aperture between the upright stones and illuminating the altar stone. Well, it was recently discovered within the last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 years that the altar stone, they always thought it was part of the same as the blue stone, which was, like I said, quarried in Wales. Well, they discovered that the altar stone was a completely different, unique type of rock. And the geologists got involved with the archaeologists and tried to locate where's the bedrock source of the rock that was became the altar stone, and it turned out it was up in the northern Scotland, up in the Orkney Islands. And as I recall, I think it weighed 12,000 pounds, so it wasn't huge, but it was heavy enough, right? It's somewhere between its source and its where it was placed in the monument. It had to be transported at least 450 miles. Right now, if you're transporting it by land, you've got to go over rivers, through thick, heavy forests that covered the British Isles at the time Stonehenge was built. You had mountains. You had to haul this thing 450 miles through treacherous terrain, or it maybe was by sea. But then, North Sea is well known for being treacherous, having enormous storms and waves. And so that wouldn't be much easier. But however they did it, it had to they transported it from northern Scotland 450 or more miles to southern England, and they set that stone up as the altar stone. Now, how did they discover that the altar stone was a third type of rock? Well, because it had a high metallic content, particularly barium. I don't know what the implications are of that yet, but it was a distinct type of rock. That's how they were able to find its origins in northern Scotland. So, like the archaeologists are studying it, said, well, we don't know what, but they must have had a compelling reason for going to all that effort to get the altar stone down there as the centerpiece of the whole monument. And the answer is, well, yeah, they certainly must have had a compelling reason. And I think the hint is it has something to do with the geochemical composition of the rock itself. But what would that be purpose? I don't know. We're still kind of in our infancy, I think, of trying to reverse engineer what I think potentially was a system of planetary energy control, maybe along the lines of where Tesla was going in his work. Utilizing, because think about this, Aaron. we know that the moon is moving in a cycle of about 28 days, right? During this, it's not exactly a circle around the Earth, but we know that the tides are intimately connected with the motions of the moon. Well, there's an ocean of water in the lithosphere moving throughout the conduits and fault lines and so forth of the crust of the Earth, which is the term for the lithosphere, right? So when the moon is moving, it's driving the tides in the ocean, but it's also moving the water through the crust. It's causing pressures to build up in the crust. And water will always seek out the zone of least resistance. Well, in the crust, that's going to be your fractures and fault lines within the crust. So it's natural that, for example, you'd have a spring. Oftentimes, is where a fracture in the Earth's crust uh, breaks through the surface of the Earth, and the water moving through that fracture uh, then discharges as a spring at the surface. Now, I think it's very likely that we should consider that moving water creates patterns of energy. It probably has a direct effect on the geomagnetic field of the Earth. And I think that the ancient peoples knew about that. The work of Paul Devereux, going back to the 80s, 90s, a British researcher who studied the geological placement of many of the ancient sacred sites and discovered a high degree of correlation between the placement of these sacred sites and the pattern of fault lines in the Earth's crust. Now, the difference between a fracture and a fault line is this: a fracture is simply a crack, right? But a fault line has this dynamic property is that the rock faces, it's like a crack, but the rock faces are moving with respect to each other and creating increasing and decreasing pressures. Um, and water is being forced through there. And I think through the combination of certain types of rock, the water moving, the subterranean tidal forces moving this water, was part of the system. It goes back to, you probably heard of Wilhelm Reich and his work. Yeah, I think that there was a lot of insight to be gained from what he was doing, because what he called the orgone force, I think, is directly connected with the plasma. And he knew that there was a high correlation between the movement of water. He found, for example, that his what he called a cloudbuster worked optimally when it was grounded into moving water, right? And then we find that all of these sacred sites all over the world are situated next to springs, next to moving water. I think what we're seeing here is the outlines of a lost technology, whereby they were utilizing the dynamic forces between Earth and the heavens above. And they were somehow able to draw on that and create civilizations that maybe didn't look anything at all like our modern civilization. And it's part of the problem is, I think, that archaeologists are kind of looking in a mirror. They're looking for, well, where's the remnants of the skyscrapers and pieces of airplanes or whatever it is you're looking for that would suggest, oh, this is advanced scientific culture. Well, I think that we have to free up our thinking from trying to find replicas of ourself and what we've created using fossil fuels and what our ancestors may have created 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, or longer. In fact, I would put the roots of an ancient civilization back in what's called the Eemian stage 5E, which was similar to our Holocene. Now, if you're going to create an advanced civilization, one of the things you have to have is you have to have enough food for people to eat, and you have to have an expanding population. Like we have been able to create this amazing planetary culture that we see emerging. You're down in Miami. What are we, 500, 600 miles apart or more? But you and I are sitting here talking to each other real time. Now, when I came into the world in the early 50s, we couldn't do this, but we've accelerated our development as a scientific culture just within a few generations. My great grandparents were born right after the Civil War. railroads are just becoming a thing. My grandparents, my grandfather on my dad's side, born in 1895, right? No radio, no television, no presence in space. Cars were just starting, you know, but nobody had cars. You know, you still had a whole profession that went around the streets of towns and cleaned up the horse poop from all the horses that everybody was still riding, right? Horses and horse-drawn carriages. So we've come an amazingly long way in an amazingly short time. How easy would it be? Let me ask you this. How easy would it be for 300, 400, 500 years of scientific progress to get lost in the noise of 200,000 years?
But I mean, all it would take is, you know, one of these events you're talking about, or the right
Correct.
solar event, or something of the
Y-
sort. Suddenly, all of a sudden, all of our tech gets burnt out, perhaps, or something of the sort.
yeah.
You know,
And
or
then you get gigantic floods. And I'm talking about floods, like one of the floods that I've studied out in the western states was measured peak discharge 800 million cubic feet per second.
mm-hmm.
How do you even visualize that? Well, if you took
Wow.
every single river on earth, think of the big rivers in South America, Amazon, Orinoco. Think about North America, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Columbia, the Ohio, the Mackenzie, the Yukon. Think about Europe, Eurasia. Think about Africa. You've got the Congo, the Nile. Think of every river, the Yellow River in China, every river, every creek, every bit of flowing water on the earth. All combined wouldn't even be 1/10 of some of the floods that swept over the earth at the end of the last ice age. Now, that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. But once you realize that phenomena like that were real, if you have a flow of water moving over the surface of the land that can literally rip out 1,000 feet of bedrock, transport that dozens or even hundreds of miles, leaving it in massive piles of rubble, what would you expect to find? Take any major city on Earth. I've done this where I've got a graphic where I've taken the skyline of Atlanta and I've juxtaposed a flood of 800 million cubic feet per second, right? Now, this flood is over 1,000 feet deep. It's moving at 50 or 60 miles an hour. In the aftermath, if a flood like that hit a city, an urban area, what are you going to find in the aftermath to show you that that urban complex had existed? Nothing, nothing at all. It's going to be completely pulverized. It's going to be reduced to just rubble, rocks, sand, gravel. And in fact, we've rebuilt civilization. If you look at all of our urban areas, all of our buildings, we're building out of concrete. The main constituent in that concrete is lime and gravel. Lime is from limestone rocks, which accumulate on the bottom of the ocean, and all the gravel is the pulverized rock that's left over from catastrophes. You go to any gravel pit, and I can show you virtually any gravel pit. It was the byproduct of deposition by catastrophic floodwaters that ripped up some pre-existing landscape, pulverized it, and dumped it somewhere else. And now we're going in there and quarrying that gravel and using it to make concrete out of.
You mentioned Wilhelm Reich, and you know, something that I'm enamored by, and I've referenced many times. I don't think on the podcast, but I teach seminars, workshops around breathing and nervous system regulation and
Yeah.
posture and movement, things like that. So orgone therapy, a part of that is, you know, harmonizing or kind of like tuning the body. One of the things he talks about in there is personality armoring, where if a person's holding on to pent up tension, you know, like emotional energy,
Yeah.
anger, resentment, whatever the things, or something they couldn't get out, it kind of like dysregulates the harmony of the person's physiology. And I wonder, because you mentioned orgone energy, he refers to as orgone energy, and Wilhelm Reich, I wonder if perhaps these ancient people or whatever, you know, ancient things that are creating these structures, I wonder if they had some awareness, the way that we can harmonize the energy of the body. I wonder if they had some awareness of harmonizing the energy of the planet and the solar system, and perhaps this body is kind of more of like a fractal that is tied to the body of Earth and is tied to the body of the solar system, et cetera, et cetera.
See, I think that's a very productive line of thinking. Well, for one thing, we can go and we can say, well, maybe not quite as ubiquitous as the flood myths, but we also have myths, universal myths of gods,
Mm-hmm.
who differed from mere mortals because they had these extended lifespans. Now, of course, we can find in the Bible, we can find replete myths and stories about ancient races of people that lived a long time. Even in Native Americans talked about their ancestors who had longevity, right? And interestingly, when you look at, like in the biblical account, the antediluvian generations were living a factor of 10, basically longer than modern lifespans.
Hmm.
Immediately after the flood, immediately after the great disruption or catastrophe, lifespans post flood were reduced to 120 years, right? And then later, subsequently, even reduced more to the 70 that's the average lifespan now. I've often wondered about that and thought it's very possible that under a different system of, say, esoteric technology, which
Mm-hmm.
is what I think was behind all of the sacred sites and so on, was the possibility that our ancestors at some time did live much longer. I think that's very something that would be worth exploring. We now know that there are on the horizon major breakthroughs in our understanding of physiology, uh, that we might extend our lifespans considerably. But if we had a system whereby there was some kind of an integral harmonic relationship between the biosphere and the geosphere or the terrasphere, very much so. I mean, like you mentioned, the heart rate, the breathing rate. If we're somehow more, maybe we could turn it around. Maybe we could say that we've essentially become out of tune
Correct.
with the planet.
Yeah.
And if we could fine tune ourselves back into resonance with the planetary dynamics, with the planetary frequencies, who knows what the outcome would be in terms of our health, our well being. But clearly, when I look at society, there's something amiss. I mean, the stuff that's going on, the violence, the discord, the wars, you see it in the urban streets now of America. Something is amiss. What is the corrective? I'm not 100% sure. I won't stand here and sit here and claim to know, but my instincts tell me that it's something that has to bring us back into a closer, intimate relationship with the harmonies, the natural harmonies of nature. And that includes not just the earth, but the larger celestial realm as well.
Hmm.
Um,
What do you
and I
think?
think the ancients knew that. They knew that somehow.
Hmm.
And they created a society, but something happened. And that's what I'm trying to get my head around. There was no doubt there was enormous catastrophes that afflicted this planet
Yeah.
at, at previous times. So it's almost as if we're given a window of opportunity between catastrophes. Here's your window. Things will be stable enough that you can develop agriculture. You can feed people, population will grow. People will get stronger, healthier, they will live longer. Now you will be able to do things that you wouldn't be able to do in a brute struggle for survival. If we look at the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, with the roughly 150 years during which these incredible Gothic cathedrals were being built. I don't know if you've toured Europe, but
I
if you
have.
yeah, so you
Yeah.
probably visited a few of the cathedrals, and you
Yeah.
stand there just in amazement, in awe, like,
Hmm.
my God, the effort that went into this to quarry the stone, to carve the stone, the statuary, the stained glass windows,
Hmm.
the engineering that went into it, the astronomical knowledge that went into it, and you look at there was 80 of these incredible monuments on the level of Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Lyon, Notre Dame, probably 400 to 500 smaller abbeys, but all being built at the same time using a similar template. Where did that inspiration come from? That's one of the great mysteries of the emergence of modern civilization, because one of the things that's obvious is that you had to have pretty much the whole of European society engaged in that project. Because if you estimate for all of that work going on, you had, let's say, 100,000 craftspeople, you know, the carpentry skills had to have been fantastic, because to build those vaults, you had to build scaffolding and formwork. Now that's all removed, but there's some very elegant and sophisticated geometry involved in the vault of a Gothic cathedral. But my point is this: that in order to undertake a project like that, that's multi-generational, you have to have a solid agricultural base. You have to have enough wealth in society that for every one person working on that project, probably 10 people are engaged in the food, the clothes, the shelter that needs to be provided for this army of builders and craftsmen. So what happened? You had the Dark Ages cold period, gave way to the medieval warm period. After 100, 150 years of agricultural surpluses, European population had grew enormously. People were healthier, they were stronger, their stature increased. And then the population grew enough that you now had the labor force that didn't exist 2 centuries earlier, that was now mobilized and organized to this incredible Gothic cathedral enterprise. Now we get to the late 12 and early 1300s, the medieval warm period comes to an end, and the beginning of the Little Ice Age occurs, and you have a period of about 20 to 30 years where there are multiple agricultural collapses. So now there are food shortages because short growing season, cold, damp summers, as the climate of the planet is shifting from global warmth to global cold of the Little Ice Age, right? So now people didn't get enough to eat. They were malnourished. The malnourishment led to compromise of their immune systems. And after about 20 to 25 years of this, you had the bubonic plague, which may have not had nearly the effect 30 or 40 years earlier, but now you had millions of people who weren't getting enough to eat, and they were malnourished, and their immune systems were weak. And so now the bubonic plague comes around in about 1340, 1342, something like that, wipes out the third of the population of Europe. And that's pretty much when this Gothic building enterprise came to an end. So my point is that this whole phenomena, miraculous phenomena, took place during this window of opportunity. And when the world changed and it was not conducive anymore, it didn't entirely 100% end, but it came close to it. Extrapolate that by an order of magnitude, and I think what we've had now is we've had 10,000 years of relatively stable climate during the epoch called the Holocene, and it has allowed us, it has given us the opportunity to create the agricultural foundation upon which any society or civilization ultimately depends. And we don't know how long this period of interglacial warmth is going to last. But we can see, looking back over the last 2.5 million years, that we don't find any examples of interglacial warmth that appear to have lasted longer than our modern Holocene.
It's something that occurs to me that we don't need to, we can kind of shift away, but it seems like perhaps ancient architecture could have been used as a form of medicine. And that's something I haven't thought about so much.
Wait, a form of what?
Medicine.
Medicine, yes, yes. Okay, absolutely.
Like it's
Absolutely.
like you think like and to tie that to something that's a little bit more like, okay, I get it. Just like the way you feel when you walk into a room, or like the value of feng shui. You know, when you go back into certain temples, or I've been through Egypt and some different places. Like I've been to Angkor Wat, and some different places like that. It's like you get there and it induces a state of awe, which is very rare
Yes.
in North America, or in the
Right.
United States at least. And it seems like as we progress into the future of technology and quote unquote progress, it seems like we're digressing away from awe-inducing architecture in a way,
We
you
are.
know,
Right.
which is kind of interesting and ironic, I think, in a way. But I wonder if perhaps there could have been some awareness, like a deep awareness of the actual, maybe like psycho-emotional, spiritual, biological effect of the buildings
Yes.
and the structures that we create, that perhaps we're missing that a little bit, and we're kind of transitioning into, let's just get it done fast and
Right.
focus on the bottom line.
Right. The bottom line. Right. Because obviously, when you're building a Gothic cathedral, your priority is not how much profit are we going to make.
Yeah.
It's how much harmony and beauty can we bring into the world. How much inspiration can we bring into the world. It's a whole different mind ethic. Um,
Hmm.
I would love to see us get back to that, and
Yeah.
I think we can get back to that at the same time we're moving forward. And I've been working, as a builder, I've been very much interested in the questions and the points you just made. Like, how can our architecture now resonate with the natural harmonies and the natural frequencies, and that can serve as an interface between we, the human scale, and the larger scale of nature?
Hmm.
And I'm very much, that's what I'm exploring and researching and trying to understand better, because whatever time I have left in this world, and hopefully it's going to be at least another quarter century, um, I'm looking at developing a prototype where we can use modern technologies but work from the ancient template.
Hmm.
And so I've looked at a lot of the to integrate a lot of the factors that seem to have been at the core of this ancient template. The thing is, and again, we this is a conversation that could go on and on. I could show you examples, for example, of monumental earthworks in North America. For example, there are square, rectilinear, um, and circles in Ohio, squares that the side of the square is almost precisely 755 feet, the same as Khufu's pyramid.
Hmm.
And this is multiple examples of that. The geometries used, again, derivative of the platonic solids that I showed you up there, and those platonic solids seem to be integral to the whole system. Again, that's beyond what we're going to be able to talk about here today, but I'd certainly be willing to continue this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Another time for sure. I would love that. Do
yeah, we can
you,
do that.
can you give me a brief response on your perspective on the city of Atlantis? And was City Atlantis real? Is there any evidence to suggest that it was a thing, or is that too big of a thing to get into right
Well, I
now?
can give you the short form. I've been a
Okay, yeah,
student of
please.
Plato for many years.
Yeah,
I've immersed myself particularly in Timaeus and Critias, the two dialogues where he describes Atlantis.
yeah.
And it just so happens coincidentally that in November, we've organized a tour, and we're going to go to where I think the most likely, if Atlantis was real and not just a metaphor concocted by Plato for his ideal, city state. If it was real, I think that there's one area that is the most likely candidate, and that is the Azores microcontinent. And it's about the size of Iceland. It's submerged along the mid Atlantic ridge where you have a triple plate junction, where the Eurasian plate meets the North American plate, meets the African plate. And there is empirical data suggesting that that microcontinent was above sea level during the late glacial maximum.
Hmm.
And it's now sunken over a mile below. But if you recall, in the beginning of our conversation, I was talking about the land rebounding when the glaciers were removed, and that trillions of tons of weight go into the North Atlantic. The bottom of the sea bottom has to do this because the geoid is constantly adjusting itself to try to maintain equilibrium. Well, Plato describes. I mean, we could. I actually, Aaron, I did a couple of lectures about 4 years ago. The total length of my lectures on Atlantis was over 8 hours.
Hmm.
And I went line by line through Plato's description. And I showed how virtually everything he describes fits the Azores. The Azores are 9 islands, but they're actually the peaks of mountains. And if you the bottoms of those mountains are on what's called the Azores microcontinent. And there's beaches along the Azores microcontinent, relict beaches, fossil beaches. There are off the shores of the microcontinent, which is now more than a mile below sea level, there are like a preserved ecosystem that would be a shallow marine ecosystem. Um, on and on. I mean, there's and that's empirical. The theoretical is yes, you have to have this response. That's part of what's called rheology, RHEOL, rheology, which is about deals with the mass distribution, the distribution of mass within the Earth. And it can be profoundly affected by the whole glacial interglacial cycle. And it looks like there was a massive subsidence along the mid Atlantic ridge precisely at the end of the last ice age. Now, Plato describes Atlantis as having existed 9,000 years before Solon's exile to Egypt, which occurred in about 600 BC. Do the math, 9,000 plus 2,000 years plus 600 is 11,600 years ago. Now, modern oceanographers and marine geologists have identified, and 11,600, by the way, is the exact end of the Younger Dryas. It is also, when I said you had that huge warming spike and there was a major influx of huge volumes of meltwater into the global oceans, right? So the pieces are fitting it. Plato gives the exact date of the end of the Younger Dryas. Coincidence? Well, maybe. I mean, your mainstream archaeologists dismiss it completely. You can't even say the word Atlantis around them. Oh,
Yeah.
you're a crackpot, you're a pseudo-archaeologist. They have all kinds of names for you. But they've never really looked into it. They don't know the geology. They don't understand rheology. They don't understand isostatic compensation and what that implies. So the short answer is I think Atlantis may have been very plausible during the late glacial maximum. In fact, that might have been one of the optimum places on Earth for a civilization to emerge and then evolve.
And then you're also in the camp, and then we'll wrap up because I know you got to go in 15 minutes. But your perspective, I would presume, aligns with John Anthony West and Robert Schoch on the origin of the pyramids being not 4,500 years ago, like mainstream archaeology says, and closer to.
That's pretty much my thought on Khufu's pyramid. Okay. I don't know about Khephrun's and Menkare's pyramids. Khufu pyramid, I would believe, is as old as the Sphinx. And the Sphinx, I've been there, studied firsthand the erosion on the quarry walls, the ditch walls around the Sphinx, and I'm 100% convinced that's severe water erosion. So then the question becomes, when did you have enough water in Egypt? And you have to go back 10, 12,000 years to get. And I know Robert Schoch has modified his estimate from 7,000 to 8,000 years. He's now looking at more like 10,000 to 12,000 years as being a minimum.
In
other words, when the waters flowed over northern Egypt, the Sphinx was already there.
So do you think that the planet could have been a pretty technologically, psycho-spiritually, energetic, bustling place 13,000 years ago?
I don't know about 13,000 years. I'd actually go back longer than that. And in our next conversation, we'll talk about this Eemian period that lasted from 116 to 130,000 years ago, and it was the closest modern analog to the Holocene. And it was actually warmer than now, and it would have been a time of prolific agriculture. And of course, in order to create advanced technology and science, you have to have division of labor. You have to have leisure time. If your day-to-day existence is just grunting along trying to get enough to eat, you're not going to have time to establish, a scientific worldview or build a civilization. So I am inclined now to go back 120,000 years and be looking at that period of time.
Well, we can save that for round two. I really appreciate you, man. It was really enjoyable
I enjoyed it.
conversation for me. Thank you, brother.
I love the breathing.
I'm glad you like that.
I did.
Yeah, before we recorded, we did like a little breathing thing. It's like a tradition before the podcast. Where can people go from here to go deeper into your world and work and learn more?
Oh, randallcarlson.com. I try to
Awesome.
keep it simple. randallcarlson.com. Mike Robertson of HowTube is building an upgraded website right now that should be functional within a couple of weeks, and he's doing an awesome job. But yeah, randallcarlson.com, and then I'm going to have links to a bunch of other stuff. Cool people. If okay with you, I'll put a link to you on there.
Yeah, please.
Okay, and but that's probably the easiest. randallcarlson.com.
Amazing. Thank you, brother. I appreciate you. Thank you all for tuning in.
Likewise, Aaron.
I'll see you next week. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed that episode, you might also enjoy this episode over here, as well as this one over here. Thank you for subscribing. Appreciate you. I'll see you in the next video.